The moment my father looked me in the eye at Thanksgiving dinner and said, "I'm grateful for all my children, just not the disappointment sitting across from me," I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I reached into my bag, pulled out a sealed envelope, slid it across the table and said, "That's for you, Dad. Happy Thanksgiving." Then I picked up my coat and walked out. He opened it 20 minutes later. I was already on the highway when my phone started ringing. He called 11 times. I know, because I counted every single one. My name is June. I'm 31 years old, and I've spent most of those years trying to earn a place in a family that never really made room for me. My father? I'll call him Dad, because that's what I called him, even when I probably shouldn't have anymore. Remarried when I was 7. My mother had died the spring before, ovarian cancer, fast and quiet and devastating in the way that only truly unfair things are. She was 34. I remember her hands more than her face now, and that's the thing grief does to you, that nobody warns you about. It takes the clearest parts and blurs them first. Dad met my stepmother at a grief support group. I used to think that was almost poetic. Two people stitching themselves back together. He seemed lighter around her. I wanted to be happy for him. I tried. Her name was Sandra, and she was not a cruel woman exactly. She was just a woman who had come into a marriage with 2 children of her own, my stepbrother, Dex, and my stepsister, Pauline, and who found it very natural to love her own children a little more loudly than she loved mine. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't movie villain stuff. It was small. It was the way she'd remember Pauline needed new shoes and forget I'd outgrown mine 2 months ago. The way Dex got a car for his 16th birthday and I got a card. The way dinner conversation flowed around me like water around a rock, not hostile, just around. And Dad went along with it. That was the part I could never quite make peace with. Not that Sandra did what she did, but that Dad let her. That somewhere along the way, loving her meant stepping back from me. That the grief group where he found her had somehow also become the place where he left me. I was a quiet kid. I read a lot. I got good grades, not because anyone pushed me, but because school was a place where the rules were clear and the feedback was honest. An A was an A. A B was a B. Nobody there looked through me. I went to community college on a partial scholarship, then transferred and finished my degree in accounting at 23. Took the CPA exam at 25. Passed on the first try. I built my own small practice by 28. Not flashy. Not tech startup rich. But mine, completely mine. Built from nothing. And I was proud of that in the quiet way you're proud of things nobody ever helped you with. Dex went to a private university on Dad's dime. Changed majors 3 times. Graduated in 5 years with a degree in communications. And now works in marketing for a company that makes protein powder. Pauline married well. Lives in a nice suburb outside of Charlotte, and has never held a job longer than 14 months. I say this not to be unkind. I say it because context matters. Because for years I watched my father hold those 2 up as examples of success, and look at me self-employed, CPA, mortgage-free by 30 like I'd somehow missed the point. The point I came to understand was that I wasn't his, not in the way that counted to him anymore. The Thanksgiving that changed everything was not supposed to be significant. It was at Dad and Sandra's house in Asheville, which they bought 4 years ago after selling the house I grew up in. The house where my mother had lived, where her garden used to be, where I used to sit on the back porch steps and think she might somehow still be in the walls of the place. They sold it without telling me it was on the market. I found out from a cousin. Dad said he thought I knew. I drove up from Greenville that Wednesday night. 4 hours. I brought a pie salted caramel apple from scratch because I'd been baking that pie since I was 12, and I still make it every year because my mother taught me how, and it's the one tradition I've kept alive entirely on my own. I set it on the counter. Sandra thanked me and put a store-bought pumpkin pie front and center on the table. Mine stayed on the counter through dinner. There were 9 of us around the table. Dad at the head. Sandra to his right. Dex and his girlfriend. Pauline and her husband and their 2 kids, who were genuinely sweet and not responsible for any of this. And me, At the far end, next to the kids, which I actually didn't mind because small children are honest, and they laughed at my jokes. Dinner was fine. Ordinary. I helped clear plates. I poured refills. I laughed when I was supposed to laugh. This is what you do when you've spent decades learning how to be present without taking up too much space. Then Dad gave his toast. He does one every year. He's always been a talker, the kind of man who treats a captive audience as an opportunity. He stood up, raised his glass, and started talking about family, about gratitude, about how proud he was to look around the table and see so much success. He talked about Dex's promotion. He talked about Pauline's new house. He talked about Sandra's volunteer work with the church. He looked at me once, at the far end of the table, and he paused. "And June," he said, with this small, almost tired smile. "Well, we're still waiting to see how that all turns out." Pauline's husband laughed a little. Dex looked at his phone. Sandra sipped her wine. The kids didn't understand and kept coloring their paper napkins. Nobody said anything. I set down my fork very carefully so I wouldn't make noise. I looked at my water glass. I counted the ice cubes. There were 4. I remember thinking, very clearly and very calmly, I am done. Not angry done. Not dramatic done. Just done. The way a door closes, not with a slam, but with a quiet final click. I reached into my bag. I'd brought the envelope 3 months ago, actually. I'd been carrying it since August, in the inside pocket of my everyday bag, because I'd learned a long time ago that in my family, you don't get to choose the moment. You just have to be ready when it arrives. I stood up. "Dad," I said, "this is for you." I walked to the head of the table. The whole table watched me do it, and I placed the envelope next to his wine glass. "Happy Thanksgiving," I said. I went back to the far end of the table, picked up my coat from the hook by the back door, hugged both of Pauline's kids, and walked out. I got in my car. I drove to a Waffle House 40 minutes south of Asheville. I ordered the scattered, smothered, and covered, and I ate it very slowly in a corner booth while the overnight staff chatted about their own Thanksgiving plans. My phone started ringing 23 minutes after I left. Dad, then Sandra. Then Dex. Then a number I didn't recognize, which turned out to be Pauline's husband calling from his cell, because apparently Pauline's hands were shaking too hard to dial. I turned my phone face down and finished my hash browns. I should tell you what was in the envelope. For that, I have to go back 8 months, to the week after my birthday in March, when I got a call from a woman named Lenora, my mother's younger sister, who I'd mostly known through Christmas cards and the occasional phone call, because Dad had always been faintly cool toward my mother's family, in a way that I'd absorbed without questioning as a child. Lenora called to ask if I'd received anything from my grandmother's estate. I hadn't even known my grandmother had passed. Dad had known somehow, he'd known, and he hadn't told me. My grandmother, my mother's mother, a woman named Harriet who I remembered only vaguely as warm hands, and a house that smelled like cedar had passed in January. In her will, she had left her house and the property it sat on to her daughter's children. Her daughter was my mother. My mother's children was me. The house was in eastern Tennessee. 4 acres. An old farmhouse, structurally sound with a barn and a creek, and a meadow that backed up against a state forest. A property assessor had valued it at just over $400,000. Lenora thought I'd already been contacted by the estate attorney. I had not. The estate attorney, it turned out, had been sending letters to my father's address because that was the address in the family records. I'd never updated it, because why would I have had reason to? And Dad had been signing for them. I'll let you sit with that for a moment. He had been receiving certified mail addressed to me about my inheritance from my mother's family for 3 months, and he had not told me. I don't know if he opened them. I will probably never know for certain, but I know he didn't tell me. And I know that when I called him the week after Lenora reached out, and I asked him, very directly, whether he'd received any mail for me, he said no. He looked me in the eye. Well, it was over the phone, so he used his voice. which I know as well as I know my own face, and he said no. I have a very good memory. I always have, and I keep records of everything. Bank statements, receipts, correspondence, voicemails. It's an accounting instinct, and also, if I'm honest, a survival instinct, developed over years of living in a family where my memory of events was frequently revised by the people around me. So I had records. I had the certified mail tracking numbers from USPS. I had the delivery confirmations with signatures. I had the estate attorney's records of what was sent and when. I had a voicemail from Dad, from February, where he mentioned the mail carrier had been leaving packages on the porch, which meant he knew the mail was arriving, which meant the no he gave me in March was either a very convenient lapse in memory or something I don't have a word for that isn't ugly. I spent 2 weeks with an attorney of my own, going through all of it. Then I put everything in an envelope, a summary of the property and its assessed value, the certified mail tracking records, the delivery confirmations with his signature, a copy of my grandmother's will, a letter from my attorney noting that any interference with the delivery of legal correspondence related to an estate is a matter that could involve civil liability, and a single handwritten note from me at the top which said, I know. I've known since March. I wanted you to know that I know. June. That was what I slid across the table at Thanksgiving. That was what he opened 20 minutes after I drove away. I heard about his reaction secondhand from Pauline, who called me 3 days later. According to Pauline, he read through the documents at the table while everyone sat there. His hands were shaking by the second page. By the time he got to the attorney's letter, he'd gone very quiet in the way that my father goes quiet when he is cornered. Not remorseful. Not yet, but calculating. Sandra tried to take the papers from him. He wouldn't let her. He left the table and went to his office and closed the door. He was in there for over an hour. Pauline said the dinner kind of dissolved after that. People made excuses. The kids fell asleep on the couch. Sandra served the pies alone. Mine, Pauline said, was the one people actually ate. I don't know why that detail stayed with me, but it did. I want to be honest with you about what happened next, because I think when people tell stories like this, they sometimes tidy up the ending in ways that real life doesn't cooperate with. My father called me 4 days after Thanksgiving. Not to apologize, exactly. To explain. There is a difference, and I have learned, at 31, to hear it very clearly. He said he hadn't opened the letters. He said he'd set them aside, meant to forward them, and then. And this is the part that I will remember for a long time. He said he hadn't wanted to deal with all that business with your mother's family. All that business. My inheritance, my grandmother's death, my mother's last material gift to me, which was land, which was roots, which was the only tangible connection I had to the woman, whose hands I still try to remember clearly, and can't quite that, was all that business he hadn't wanted to deal with. I let him finish. Then I said, I'm going to need you to courier the original letters to my attorney's office. His address is in the packet I gave you. He was quiet for a moment. June. I'm not angry, Dad, I said. And I meant it, mostly. I'm just done pretending. He sent the letters, all of them unopened, which told me something I'm still not sure how to feel about. The estate was settled in February. The farmhouse is mine now. I drove out to see it in March, on the anniversary of my mother's death, which felt right in a way I couldn't have planned. It was cold, and the creek was high, and the barn needed work, and I stood in the meadow for a long time just listening to the water. I cried there. Not at the Thanksgiving table, not on the highway, not at the Waffle House. There, in the meadow with the mud on my boots and the state forest behind me, and 4 acres of ground that had been my grandmother's and before that her mother's, and that was now mine. I'm not sure yet what I'll do with it. I might fix up the house and rent it. I might move there eventually. I might just drive out a few times a year and stand in the meadow and let the creek be loud. My father and I don't talk much now. Not because there was a dramatic falling out, there wasn't. There was just a gradual, mutual acknowledgement that we had reached the limits of what we were able to be to each other. He sends a text on my birthday. I reply. That is, for now, what we are. Sandra called me once, in April, to say she hoped we could all move forward. I told her I was already moving forward, which was true. Dex has not reached out. This does not surprise me or particularly hurt me. We were never close. We were two children in the same house who moved through parallel orbits for years and then moved apart. That's its own kind of sad. But it's not the sharp kind. Pauline and I have actually talked more in the last few months than we have in years. She called me in January and said, I didn't know he had those letters. I believe her. She said, I'm sorry I laughed at his toast. I told her the truth, which was that I understood that when you're at a table and the person at the head of it makes a joke at someone else's expense, the easiest thing is to laugh. And I'd done the same thing for years at other people's expense. And I was trying not to anymore. She was quiet for a second, and then she said, You're a lot more generous than I would be. I don't know if that's true. I think I'm just tired of carrying anger that was never mine to carry in the first place. The thing about growing up as the one who doesn't quite fit is that you spend so much energy trying to shrink yourself into the shape the family needs you to be. You eat less. You ask for less. You make yourself easy and quiet and low maintenance, and you tell yourself, this is maturity. This is grace. This is the high road. But at some point, if you're lucky, if you pay attention, you realize that you weren't being gracious. You were just disappearing, and disappearing is not the same as surviving, even though it can look like it from the outside. I'm not disappearing anymore. I have a business I built without anyone's help. I have an apartment with a balcony where I keep too many plants and none of them are dying. I have a best friend named Carla who makes me laugh until I can't breathe, and who drove 4 hours to sit with me when I got back from the meadow that March day. I have a therapist I see every other week who has helped me understand that needing people to see you is not weakness, it is human, it is normal, and being denied it for years is something you are allowed to grieve. And I have 4 acres in eastern Tennessee, with a creek and a barn and a meadow, that my grandmother left me because I was my mother's daughter, and she wanted me to have something that said, You come from somewhere. You belong to something. My mother has been gone for 24 years. I still can't picture her face as clearly as I want to, but I can picture her garden the way she'd kneel in the dirt in the early morning, the green smell of tomato plants, the sound of her humming something I could never quite make out. I think she would have liked the meadow. I think she would have said, This is yours, June. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. I'm not letting anyone tell me otherwise anymore. I used to think that walking away from a table was giving up, that the person who left first was the one who lost. It took me a long time to understand that sometimes leaving is the only honest thing left to do. When I slid that envelope across to my father and walked out of his house, I wasn't running. I was finally telling the truth, not with my voice, but with my feet, and with 3 months of documented evidence that said, I see what happened. I know what you did. And I'm not pretending anymore. What I've come to understand is that things don't fall apart randomly. They fall apart in the direction they were already leaning. My father didn't intercept those letters because he was careless. He intercepted them because for years, in small and quiet ways, he had been choosing Sandra's comfort over my presence, Dex's ambitions over my accomplishments, the path of least resistance over the harder work of being a fair parent. The envelope was just the moment the whole accumulated weight of those choices became impossible to ignore. Cause and effect. It always catches up. I think about integrity a lot these days, not as a concept, but as a daily practice. As the habit of doing the right thing, even when no one is watching, even when it costs you something, even when it would be easier to set the mail aside and tell yourself you'll deal with it later. My father failed that practice quietly, over months, and it cost him more than he expected. I passed it, also quietly, by keeping records and staying calm and not screaming at the dinner table when every part of me wanted to. Neither of us announced what we were doing, but both of us lived with what we chose. The part I'm most proud of, and I say this not to pat myself on the back, but because I think it matters, is that I figured it out. I didn't take anyone's word for it. I asked Lenora the right questions. I pulled the tracking numbers. I called the estate attorney. I built the case not out of anger, but out of clarity. Because I'd spent enough years being gaslit by people who were very confident and very wrong. And I had decided I would rather be a person who verifies than a person who assumes. That kind of clear-eyed thinking is something I had to build deliberately, the same way I built my business. One careful, unglamorous step at a time. And then there was the question of whether I could keep going when it was hard. When I was the one driving 4 hours to a family dinner, I already half-dreaded. When I was the one making the pie nobody put on the table. When I was the one sitting at the far end next to the kids, making myself small so the room would stay comfortable. I kept going. Not because I was strong in some grand sense, but because I refused to disappear. I showed up. I documented. I waited for the right moment, and when it came, I was ready. The meadow in Tennessee is still there. The creek is still loud. I'm going back in the fall, and I'm thinking about planting something. I don't know what yet. Something that takes a few seasons to really take hold. My mother would have known exactly what to plant. I'm still learning.